Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is my friend Dr. Christian Keller, a history professor at the Army War College in Carlisle. Chris, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing exceptionally well because I'm super excited we get to talk because as a Stonewall Jackson fanboy, I'm really excited to talk Stonewall Jackson with you today. So I couldn't be happier.
Absolutely.
Chris is the author of one of my favorite books on Jackson, The Great Partnership, which outlines his relationship with Robert E. Lee and how that evolves. And the subtitle of the book talks about the fate of the Confederacy. That's a big statement.
Yeah, I thought about that before I submitted the manuscript to my agent for marketing to the presses. And initially, it was entitled Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Confederate Strategy in the East, 1862 to 1863. But I thought better of that. I thought that might be an arcane academic sounding title. And because my agent had said, think about a title that would be appealing to the more general reader, I retitled it. And the more I thought about it, the more it made great sense because the loss of Jackson through the course of my research for that book, which was conducted over 10 years, Chris, it became obvious to me that the loss of Jackson actually was not some old cliche that has been laughed at over the years by pedigreed historians, but in fact, it was a watershed event at the strategic level for the fate of the Confederacy. And I go into several different reasons why in the book. And the big thesis is, of course, that Jackson was essential to Lee's strategic thinking and that he was himself a strategic level thinker, not just Lee's right hand operator, which is often understood, but that he was actually thinking at the strategic level, though he never was given the opportunity to perform at that level. And when he fell, Lee was obviously robbed of his right arm, as he himself admitted. And we all know what that meant for the Pennsylvania campaign and later on into 64. But he also lost a friend and he lost a strategic counselor. And that's not really been mentioned much in the literature, but the primary sources spoke for themselves.
And I should point out the book came out in 2019, but talking about Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee and their relationship, an evergreen topic. And there are aspects about this we'll explore today. But I think it's ironic when you talk about Jackson as a strategic thinker, and the cover of the book actually features a photo by Mort Kunstler called Strategy and Tactics,
Right.
and sort of playing off that generally understood idea of Lee as the strategic thinker, but Jackson more as the tactical thinker. And yet your book really kind of pushes that idea to some new levels.
I really wanted to do that. There were some previous authors like Charles Royster who had hinted in this direction. And James Cagle had hinted in this direction, but nobody had really looked hard at the vast amount of primary source material that was out there from the staff officers of both men, from the newspapers especially. The newspaper editorials were extremely forthcoming about how Jackson was understood by the people of the Confederacy. And I'm a believer, and I know others disagree, but I believe that newspaper editorials speak to a degree for the readership that read them. And therefore, you have to say, well, somebody believed this. It wasn't just the editor himself. The papers wouldn't have continued in subscription otherwise. So uh, I got into a lot of interesting things, and there were a lot of sources that were out there for years and years and years, such as the official records, Chris, where the material was there for anybody who really wanted to look at it. But I don't think they looked at Jackson in this manner before, nor the relationship between he and Lee, which was extremely deep. And I'm not sure why that was, but I jumped at it. I said, this to me is quite obvious. But again, it took about a decade of research to get to this and to really piece through all of the evidence. I that Mort Kunstler painting captured the essence of the relationship.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it does.
I lived with the title of the painting, and I told the press, uh, just pay for the rights for that. I know the title's off, but it captures the essence of their relationship so well, which Kunstler does so well in so many of his paintings. And I just decided I'd take that small hit on the title.
Well, I have that very painting hanging at the bottom of the stairs as I walk downstairs. So
I am not surprised to hear that, Chris, and kudos to you.
I really like the way you talk about having to piece together the evidence because, it seems to me that because Lee doesn't leave memoirs afterwards, so he's not commenting things. Jackson doesn't leave behind memoirs, nor does he leave a whole lot of letters where he's talking strategy and tactics. So the most obvious sources that might exist for exploring this relationship don't exist. So you really did, have to kind of plumb a lot of other evidence to pull this together.
That's right. And a lot of it had to do with what I call smoke, historical smoke. And I'm sure you've discovered this in the course of all of your books research as well, Chris. But sometimes we don't get the smoking gun. Now, we know it's there. You can smell it. Your historian Scooby sense will tell you that the smoking gun's out there, but it probably was destroyed long ago. It's lost. It's not yet uncovered. It hasn't come out of somebody's attic yet. So you have to work with what you've got, and you'll find this historical smoke, as I call it. And I found a lot of it in staff officers' accounts. Now, some of them were indeed written during the Lost Cause era of writing. And then when that happens, what you have to do is triangulate those sources with reputable period sources from the war itself, which I tend to think are pretty ironclad, and other sources, both secondary and primary, to ascertain just how much of a lost cause influence is at work in these post-war memoirs by staff officers and others. And I did that work. It took a long time. But for instance, I found that Jedediah Hotchkiss is extremely reliable. And Bud Robertson found that out too, by the way. He did a lot of the groundbreaking research on Robertson in the Library of Congress, or on Hotchkiss. And a lot of Hotchkiss's writings that he did post-war, and he exchanged a lot, as you know, with Hunter McGuire, they're actually fairly reputable. I only smelled lost cause-isms a few times, and I was really happily surprised by that. And even Henry Kidd Douglas, who is infamous for having, shall we say, faulty memory. I think that's a kind statement.
Yeah, that's a
Uh,
very kind way of putting it.
yeah, even he, if you triangulate some of his statements, you're going to find there's a good deal of an essence of truth, at least, in some things that he said. For example, the Jeffersonton Conference prior to Second Manassas, which few people really know about, but it was the planning conference.
Mhm.
And that's another Kunstler painting, by the way, that memorializes that. And really, you've got Henry Kidd Douglas and one other source that really documented. So sometimes you get to a point where you have to look at a questionable source and make a call. So there were some of those instances, but frankly, Chris, not many, because I was able to look at wartime sources and do this triangulation, as I call it, with other sources to determine the veracity of post-war letters and memoirs. Often that said really great stuff, but you had to double check it. You can't just go with it right away and say, well, it must be true, as we all know.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing I always found with Douglas is, he doesn't necessarily have the political agenda that some other authors do. It's more like, look how awesome I am, which is a very
Right, right.
personal sort of agenda, but
That's his agenda. He's trying to show just how great he was. You know, the old canard that the book should be retitled Stonewall Rode with Me, which I
yeah.
think is pretty fitting.
So, and I love the fact that you have identified the historian's Scooby sense as a very important tool, which I agree with as well. So you mentioned the planning session there just before Second Manassas. Maybe that's a good way to kind of um, look at the Lee Jackson relationship in a broader sense, because your book is really focused on how that works. And one thing that I love the book, and when I finished, I was like, Well, what about Longstreet? What about Stewart? And I know that's not the book you were writing, so it's not a criticism at all. But it does seem that a lot of times when people are on Team Jackson, that means you can't be on Team Longstreet, or and so let's talk about that broaden the lens out just a little bit. And how do you look at the Lee-Jackson relationship as it works within that larger command structure, particularly in 1863?
That's a great question, Chris, and one that really warrants, I think, a good evaluation. First thing first, I spend a lot of time talking about Longstreet in the book, and just how essential he was to Lee's command team. I call that trio directly underneath Lee in the 1862 to 63 period, when the Army of Northern Virginia had a pretty good fighting chance against the Army of the Potomac, had a good chance to win the war in the East, and I definitely believe it did. I call them the Great Triumvirate because honestly, the three had developed a synergy by the time of the Chancellorsville campaign. Now, obviously, Longstreet's not there, and one can only wonder if Longstreet had been there, how things might have turned out. It would have been a very different campaign, I would offer.
Yeah.
But Lee and Longstreet, excuse me, Jackson and Longstreet did not have a rivalry. There's very little historical evidence that shows there is a great rivalry at all. It's probably a very small amount of good-natured ribbing. There's some evidence of that in the Second Manassas campaign, for instance. Perhaps a little bit of envy later on from Longstreet towards the memory of the dead Jackson and how he was being judged against that. But Longstreet did write, or whoever wrote in his memoirs, wrote that he found General Lee much distraught over the loss of Jackson when he rejoined him after Chancellorsville. And Longstreet had kind words to say in his From Manassas to Appomattox about Jackson's contribution. And therefore, if you look at it from that lens, from the post-war period, Longstreet didn't have an awful lot negative to say about Jackson, and the wartime record doesn't show that either. Jackson, there's almost nothing in extant wartime Jackson letters or from his staff indicating any envy or jealousy towards Longstreet. So as far as that relationship is concerned, I think it was a professional working relationship. And the two understood that they were part of this great triumvirate. And we all know how critically Stuart worked with Jackson on
Mhm.
several of the campaigns, including Chancellorsville and Second Manassas. And of course, Jackson and Stuart, as you know, were really tight. And frankly, uh, there was a great letter that Stuart wrote to Mariana Jackson after her husband's death, and I quote this in the book, and this might be known to some listeners, but he wrote, "I have lost the best friend I ever had." Now, he literally wrote that during the war to Mariana Jackson. I don't think we should doubt the sincerity of Stuart's thought on that. They were very close. And that tightness in that bond meant there was a solid second tier level of command and control underneath Robert E. Lee, which Lee could count on, and he knew it. And maybe there wasn't such a tight bond between Jackson and Longstreet, but there was professional trust. And they respected each other, and Longstreet respected Stuart. It was an unbeatable command team for the period that it existed.
Mhm.
And really, the Union Army of the Potomac was at that time going through an identity crisis in its command and control, as many people know, trying to figure out what exactly, who exactly it served. Did it serve the president and the country, or did it serve George McClellan? And there was a lot of fractiousness in the high command, as everybody knows, up until Gettysburg, and it even continued after that. But it finally got sorted out under Grant. But um, the point is that the Union command team just couldn't match for about a 10-month period what the Confederate command team offered. That said, Chris, I'll just quickly add this. There's a fragility there, a brittleness in the Confederate command team, which means that if any one of those three in the triumvirate fall, Lee's going to be handicapped in his ability to prosecute his victories. And I make that point in the book too. So it isn't all raw Confederate command team. There's also kind of, and I bring this out in the so what synopsis for leaders today in the book, you need to have a bench. You need to have, if not 3 or 4 Jacksons and Longstreets, you need to have maybe a Longstreet minus and a Jackson minus waiting in the wings, people who can rise up and
Yeah.
take their place, and they're going to be able to do a good enough job, and then they can learn and they can get into the position. The Confederates didn't have that bench, and that's part of the reason they lost the war. I really think that's a strategic level reason. I've written about that in other places. They just didn't have a bench of strategic level and highly competent core, i.e., operational level leaders who could replace those who fell earlier. And
Yeah.
there you go.
I agree 100%. I feel like, once the triumvirate either gets killed or wounded, like really, Wade Hampton steps up to fill Stewart's shoes in a pretty competent way. But
Does well.
there's no one who can fill Longstreet's shoes. Richard Anderson, pretty vanilla guy. You know, um, and of course it takes Ewell and Hill to step up for Jackson, and that still doesn't work.
No,
So there's,
no.
the B team is not nearly the strength of the A team there.
And it's always struck me, Chris, how Lee is fighting with his B team through most of the Overland campaign. I mean, literally,
Yeah.
Stuart's knocked out at the end of the Wilderness. Longstreet's knocked out in the Wilderness. So for the rest of the Overland campaign, the vast majority of it, Lee's fighting with the B team of his immediate subordinates. I mean, Mr. Anderson, as I facetiously call R.H. Anderson, really, I mean, he's just not there. You're very kind in how you called him, Vanilla Anderson. I'm going to remember that. Uh, Competent, but the Peter principles at work here. He's just not at the level that the others were. Ewell just starts to fail and does okay at the Wilderness, and then afterwards just not as well. Spotsylvania, as you know, and Lee has to shelve him and put him in command at Richmond. And uh, well, who's he got? And Hill. Hill blew it at the Wilderness,
Yeah.
so he's really just not doing that well. Whereas on the other side, the Federals now have an A-plus commander under Grant, and that command team, after a shakeout in the Wilderness, which we can admit it was not perfect there at all,
Mm.
they start to get their act together. And it takes some time, but they have replacements for example, when Sedgwick gets shot, they have people that can rise to take the position over. And so that Union bench starts to really play a strategic role. And I think there's a big reason when it comes to understanding how and why the Overland Campaign turns out the way it does, and Lee gets stuck in the siege at Petersburg, when it comes to thinking about the command teams at work. And how many people do you have who are competent at the level of command that you need them at? The Confederates had just run out. I'm not trying to oversimplify it in any sense, obviously, but I see that as a major reason why Grant ultimately corners Lee at Petersburg.
Yeah. Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. And I think you do a really nice job of showing, in the aftermath of Jackson's mortal wounding at Chancellorsville, well, okay, this army has to go off to Gettysburg, and we can already understand his absence and Lee trying to figure that out. Do you think I'm trying to think how to phrase this question, because I don't think Lee does a good job figuring it out right away.
Mm.
But why doesn't he figure it out well right away? Maybe that's the best way
So
to.
that's another great question, Chris. And there's a very basic answer, and then there's a kind of more subjective, harder to prove answer. The basic answer is rooted in simple chronological timing, which is evident in the source material. Is Lee had a week and a half between the assumption of command of Hill and Ewell, which was roughly about the same time, and the advent of the movement north to Pennsylvania. A week and a half to get them up to speed, to counsel them. Now, Lee was not known for being a great mentor to his subordinates, so he's not necessarily incredibly gifted in that quality, as leaders today in our armed forces are instructed to be, at least, and they try to be. That was not yet cultured in the American military or in the Confederate military, as it were. Lee may have spoken to Ewell the source material on that is sketchy, as I write in the book. There's no evidence he counseled A.P. Hill at all. It doesn't mean he didn't do it. But a week and a half's hardly enough time for Hill or Ewell, for that matter, to get used to their new positions of higher responsibility. And I think if you want, again, a basic explanation for why the new command team is not moving like a greased wheel, if you will, and not working as well as the first one, the Great Triumvirate, uh, it really has to do with just not enough time before the movement north begins, and then everything starts to go into motion. And once you're on the campaign, as you know, generals don't have time to go counsel subordinates that much in the Civil War, and they don't have it now either. Uh, when you're out in deployment today, there's precious little time to counsel subordinates. You want to try to do it, but you're putting in 18 to 20-hour days sometimes. When do you find the time? And in the Civil War, when they're on active campaigning, and especially this campaign, the Confederate high command didn't have time to do a lot of this mentorship. And so uh, Hill and Ewell had to learn by doing. Lee did make a judgment that they would be able to do that. He judged they would be able to rise to the occasion. And where there was some confirmation of that was, of course, Ewell's performance at 2nd Winchester. He does pretty well there. And for a while, everybody said, oh, it's going to be the next Jackson. But then there's the waffling on the first day at Gettysburg. Now, I defend Ewell in the book on this a bit, and I defend him on my staff rides there with my students and with other groups. I think Ewell got put between a rock and a hard place on that decision making. But I also do think Lee made his point very clear on what he wanted to be done against Cemetery and possibly also Culp's Hill. And I do think that the old canard that Jackson would have attacked, if it had been him in place of Ewell, I think there's no question he would have done it because he understood Lee's intent. Ewell didn't have time to get used to Lee's command style, which was intent based. He hadn't had that. He hadn't served directly under Lee at all. He had served under Jackson, and he'd had that 9-month absence after Second Manassas because he got shot in the leg. So you got to throw a bone to Ewell, I think, when you think about his performance in the Pennsylvania campaign. I don't throw him a whole bone. I throw him kind of a chicken bone, Chris. But I don't fall for the old lost cause argument that he totally blew it. I think he weighed his options, but he just wasn't Jackson. And for that matter, as I write in the last chapter of the book, as you know, my main point is that the absence of Jackson in the Pennsylvania campaign meant that the character of the campaign was extremely different from what it would have otherwise been. I don't think the fight would have been at Gettysburg if Jackson had survived or hadn't been shot at all at Chancellorsville. So that would have had a profound effect on the course of the history of the Eastern Theater and possibly the war. Um, Hill Hill's a harder one to decipher, and we don't know much about what Hill was thinking and doing on the march north into Pennsylvania, and we don't know that much about what he did at Gettysburg itself. The official records are sparse. There's very precious few records and source material on him during that battle. I do believe that he and Lee were standing next to each other when Ewell asked for clarification on how to proceed with the proposed assault against Cemetery Hill, if practicable. And what happened? We don't know what conversation, if any, ensued between Lee and Hill at that moment when Ewell's note came in, asking for support and asking for further instructions. I think that would have been great to find that, but we don't have it. So it's another example of no smoking gun, and frankly, there's not a lot of smoke on Hill either. So there you go. That's a
Yeah.
long answer to a great simple question.
No, no, it's a great answer too. And I tend to give Ewell more of a bone on the first day because I think that, he checks the flanks,
He
he's
does.
aware of all those sorts of things Jackson would have done, reconnaissance. I mean, that's when Jackson gets shot. He's doing reconnaissance.
And he doesn't know what he doesn't know. And
Yeah.
you have to throw him that he just doesn't know what's going on off to the other side of Culp's Hill. He's worried about that. this unknown mass of Union soldiers out there. What might that have been? It could have hit him in the flank as he was assaulting the hill. He's trying to be prudent. So yeah, again, I'm with you on that. You can't just pillory Ewell on day one at Gettysburg and blame him for not being Jackson.
I blame it all on Jubal Early, you know.
The bad old man.
That old man. And that's probably the one place I think things would have been different because, you know, when Ewell tells Early, well, go take that hill. And Early's like, my guys, I think Jackson would have said, you're
True.
under arrest. You go do it. And then, you know,
Exactly.
Gordon would have gone and done it or whatever. You know, I don't think Jackson would have put up with that nonsense from Early like
I
Ewell did.
agree.
But is this though maybe one of Jackson's great flaws as a commander is that he hasn't developed his bench. So when Ewell and Hill get called up from the bullpen, they don't know how to work with Lee because Jackson hasn't worked with them in that sort of way to cultivate them as being able to step up.
I definitely think that, Chris, and I also write about that in the book. The book is certainly not a paean to the fallen Jackson. I will take him to account when he needs to get that based on the historical record, and this is one of his flaws. He's a terrible mentor, and plays his cards close to his chest, and a lot of that is for his belief in operational security. So he definitely has his reasons for it. He's afraid of word leaking out somehow to the enemy, but he rarely informed his subordinates what he was going to do on the morrow. And this comes glaringly home to roost after he's wounded on May 2nd at Chancellorsville. And Colston and Rhodes and Hill aren't really sure what his plans were.
Mhm.
And then Stuart, who assumes command, has to send Sandy Pendleton to Jackson's tent, as you know, and ask for clarification. And Jackson's too groggy to tell him anything. He tells Pendleton to go back to Stuart and tell him, well, do what General Stuart should think he should do. That Stuart should make his own call. It's absolutely useless advice. And all of that would not have been necessary. And I'm using this just as a quick little case study
Yeah.
if Jackson had shared his plans more with his subordinates, and that incredible belief in the need for secrecy was a problem. And he did not believe that there needed to be time spent with subordinates that he didn't necessarily like. I don't think he liked AP Hill at all,
Yeah.
personally. And so he didn't want to spend time with them. Whereas he liked Robert E. Lee and he liked spending time with his fellow Christian friend there. He liked Jeb Stuart, which is truly the odd couple of the Civil War. I mean, those two are quite different. But Stuart was a believing Christian, and that makes a difference for Jackson. That made all the difference. And he couldn't claim that for Hill. And that I think was part of it. But Hill had an obstreperous personality, which didn't help and rubbed Jackson the wrong way. But he didn't spend time with him, which is one way that you build that trust between commander and subordinate. Then, secondly, the operational security thing. And then, thirdly, Jackson just expected people to do things. He just expected them to perform, as you know, without much guidance. Well, you're in this position, Colonel, so execute. Well, why can't you do it? Well, why can't you do it? I mean, okay, you can't do it, then I'm going to put you up on charges, and then it's court-martial time. He just didn't have a tolerance or an understanding, I think, for um, the need for people to be seasoned and to learn. You didn't get a lot of grace, interestingly, from Jackson in a professional sense, whereas you could get it in a personal sense if he believed that you too were a Christian believer. A really interesting mix of personality traits and foibles in Stonewall Jackson. That'd be my answer to your question on that.
Yeah, I mean that's why I find him so endlessly fascinating, and you know your interest about or your point about putting in time is I think just brilliant because you know he does put in that sort of time with Ewell. They work really well together during the Valley
The
campaign. The more
Valley.
time they spend, but then
Yep.
Ewell's out for 9 months, right? And so he doesn't have that mentorship for the 9 months prior to ascending to
That
command.
is true. That is true. Yeah, and that's a very good point. In the Valley, Jackson did put in the time for the relationship with Ewell, and Jackson worried about Ewell's soul. Initially, Ewell probably was not a Christian, and at some point between the Valley and the end of the 7 days, the records indicate Ewell may have finally made the decision
Yeah.
and gone over to Christ. I it's again, I write about that in the book. It's imprecise. Records don't say 100%, but I do think Jackson got to Ewell. There's a great quote where Ewell said, "If this is religion, then I must have it."
Yeah.
You're probably familiar with that. So yes, there was at one point an earlier tightness between Jackson and Ewell, but then Ewell gets shot, and that's the end of that.
And then that mentorship with Hill that doesn't exist, and
Yep.
obviously that very contentious relationship. So Hill doesn't get that sort of leadership training when he goes to Corps Command, but then he's also put in a position where he has to cooperate, not just with Ewell on that first day, but with his longtime rival Longstreet on the
Mhm.
second day. And so when the
Mhm.
attack is supposed to kind of get passed off from Longstreet to Hill, Hill couldn't be any less engaged in that. And so there again, I think just that lack of leadership training really comes into play, and Hill lets his personal feelings get in the way, I think. You know?
I would agree. So Hill on the second day is a bit of a conundrum. Um, a lot more might have been accomplished if he had been more forthcoming. And I agree with you. He could have been more coordinated, is I think a safe way to put it, with Longstreet. And of course, Lee was expecting this. But something that I think all the listeners may already know intuitively, but I think we need to hit it on the head here, is Lee was still operating. And this, I don't really blame him for this. It's a natural thing. He had operated for 10 months under the command team that had been shattered with the death of Jackson. But he had himself not yet adjusted to the reality that that command team was now shattered. And in place of Jackson, you have Ewell and Hill. And Lee had not made the adjustments either in his own head. And he just expected his subordinates to work together as the previous command team subordinates had done, and to just work it out. And if you look at his orders for the second day, there's this assumption almost that everyone's going to work together. Now, on the other hand, Lee perhaps should be given some censure for not looking at the reality of the situation. Some historians do. Nolan and Connolly and others, more recent than they, say that okay, so that could be true. He has a new command team, but he should have been more aware. Why didn't he hold more command conferences at Gettysburg and so forth? Okay, fair enough. I would definitely accede to those points. But I think psychologically, and this is hard to put your finger on, but I think that Lee's still operating psychologically under the old command team assumptions. But that's not true now. He's got two new guys. And remember, Longstreet is now reassuming primacy. And this is something that the Longstreet lovers hate to hear and they hate to admit it. But Jackson temporarily, I think you'll agree with me, Chris, he temporarily became Lee's number one during the winter of 62 and 63 when Longstreet's away in Suffolk in Southeast Virginia. And whether or not that was because their relationship had gotten closer, deeper religious bond, deeper friendship bond, incredible professional trust, obviously, and Longstreet wasn't there to compete with that. You can make all kinds of arguments, but now Longstreet is reassuming his position as Lee's number one. And that's an adjustment for him. And he also may have been, as you know, under an assumption about the character of the campaign or the tactical fight. That big debate's out there still. There's an awful lot, I think, that should raise questions in our minds about why the Confederates failed at Gettysburg. And what I try to say in my last chapter is a lot of them can be indirectly, if not directly, traced to the death of Jackson. And it's because it disrupts everything. The death of Jackson is incredibly disruptive to Lee's command team, from which a lot of the mistakes at Gettysburg devolve. And I've
Yeah.
long argued that Gettysburg was very well fought by George Gordon Meade, a B plus Union Army commander. He's not an A, he's a B plus. but the Confederate command team performed at a C or C minus level of ability against what had normally been an A or an A minus level. And that, in the end, is a way to kind of judge these two armies at Gettysburg. Meade did great work. We're not talking about him here. I definitely throw a lot of bones in his direction at Gettysburg, especially on the second day. But I wonder how he would have fared in a campaign which would have assumed a very different character with a Jackson, Longstreet, Stuart team still in operation.
Right.
I wrote an article about that in Gettysburg Magazine, and so far they haven't shouted down my throat. Uh, so
Yeah, I don't see any torches and pitchforks in the window
no, they
behind you.
haven't come after me on that. I think I couched it carefully enough. So
Well, and of course, now we're getting into the weeds about sort of the hypotheticals, but
yeah.
then is also Meade free to maneuver, or is he kind of tied down by all of those stay between the army and Washington and all that stuff too, which
Right.
hampers his abilities in the fall of '63.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
and I think, and I'm just kind of thinking this through based on what you've just said about Jackson's mortal wounding shatters the army, which 100%. I think Longstreet's absence, in a lot of ways, it doesn't shatter the army, but I mean, it's a significant blow to the army because when he comes back, the army's is just significantly different with the new command structure, Lee's relationship to McLaws and Anderson, who's worked with a lot closer, and that changes
Yeah.
the dynamics in the First Corps. And so, I
Yeah.
mean, it's Longstreet's absence has a huge, huge impact on kind of how that leadership team is or isn't able to recoalesce after Jackson's wounding.
That's a superb point, and one I think is not very well remembered, Chris, because McLaws and Anderson, right on the money, they're working directly under the big boss, under Lee at Chancellorsville, and they do okay until May 4th. We could get into that if you wanted to. They do okay, and I think, frankly, okay to good. I would give them that much. But the point is that they're working directly under the big boss, getting used to his predilections, and they've temporarily forgotten about their intermediate boss, or raider, as we say in the DoD, Longstreet, and now he's back. And Longstreet also, remember, didn't have the most positive experience in the southeastern Virginia campaign. He didn't really accomplish a lot. He knew it, and he knew Lee knew it.
Mm.
The official records make it very clear. Lee is impatient and unhappy with Longstreet's performance there. And I do go into that in the book, and I do some comparisons with Lee's tone in his verbiage as captured in the official dispatches with Longstreet versus his communications at the time with Jackson and documented exchanges that he had during that winter. So is Longstreet coming back into a weird situation? Yes. And I think that definitely means things for the ensuing campaign. That's another factor that's often neglected.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe this is sort of where too the myth building about Jackson has begun, and maybe some of the divide between the Jackson and Longstreet camps start. Because I do think Longstreet's a little jealous of the renown Jackson had earned for himself during the Valley campaign. He becomes world famous. Longstreet wants a little of that, and his chance for independent command at Suffolk doesn't give him that. Later on, his opportunity at Knoxville doesn't give him that. He
Oh,
comes back to the East, gets shot in the neck. So like he never really has that chance to get that. And I don't have a whole lot of evidence that Longstreet's bitter about Jackson, but I think earlier you said that he's maybe a little jealous of the memory of Jackson. And I think all of
mhm.
that stuff kind of contributes to that. I don't know what you think.
Agree. I definitely agree with that. And he also was very unfairly attacked by the Jackson acolytes in the post-war era. They really went after him hard. And they're the origin, of course, of most of the accusations of the slowness of Longstreet at Gettysburg. A lot of that came from Jackson people. And what did they really know? I would ask. Some of them knew some things, but they didn't know as much as they thought they did. And they were probably uh, being overly harsh on Longstreet there. They went after Ewell a little bit too. everyone was trying to explain Confederate defeat at Gettysburg, and Longstreet has to labor under this, and obviously holds his peace as long as he can, but then he finally has to publish those articles, and then he gets in trouble, and that starts the long slog of the destruction of Longstreet's reputation, which a lot of authors have recently turned to, and how he tried to vindicate it. Yeah, I agree with you. I think he's wrestling with the memory and the ghost of Jackson for the rest of his life. But during the war itself, yeah, a little jealousy about the renown of the Valley Campaign and Jackson's fame that came with that. But I did not encounter much evidence at all, and I looked for it. I mean, I actually was looking for it, and it wasn't there. I couldn't find it from Longstreet, didn't find it from his aides like Sorrell or anybody else. It just wasn't there that he, during the war, had some sort of jealousy problem with Jackson. And as much as some people might want to find that, you have to go with what the record says, and that's what I found in the record.
Yeah, yeah. I found the same sort of thing, and just in and I really like the way you characterize that. Some people want it to be there, and it always surprises me that there are people who are, it's a zero-sum thing. You can either be a Longstreet fan or you can be a Jackson fan, but you can't be both. And and there's a
And that's
vilification.
fallacious. I
I
mean, you
know.
can you can admire both of them for different reasons, and I do. I go back and forth on Longstreet at Gettysburg. You could ask my students 5 years ago where I was, and it'd probably be different from now. But I think there's much to praise about both of them. It's really a false narrative to try to tout one over. I mean, and it's kind of moot, obviously, at this point. And I think it was Gary Gallagher who said this is one of the most idiotic debates that ever existed about which one was better, because in the end they lost. So, I mean, really, why do we have to make a choice? You don't have to make a choice. They were both excellent for different reasons. And, you know, um, one of the authors I researched, and I did reproduce this in the book, said that you have with Jackson, you have the rapier, you have the fencing sword, if you will, that does fast lightning strokes, as in a fencing match, and it can bedazzle an opponent, and it can move fast and quickly. Whereas with Longstreet, you have either the heavy shield or you have the heavy broadsword.
Mm,
And they have different functions if you think about it in that analogy. Both are useful for different things at different times, but you need both if you're going to be a good warrior. And Lee knew how to handle them. He knew how to use them in tandem. I think Second Manassas is a great example of using them in tandem, and Stuart in his proper role as well. It's really one of the great campaigns. I have empathy for authors who make the case that actually Second Manassas was Lee's great battle.
mhm,
If you look at it, you can make some cases for that. You can make a lot of arguments for it. Chancellorsville showed his genius, but as your 160 series on Chancellorsville made very clear, and I've long agreed with this, that Lee and his command team there got lucky because Joe Hooker made so many mistakes. I mean, there's no
yeah.
question of that. So anyway, we could go on and on.
Yeah, yeah. So, and this has been a really wonderful discussion about sort of like the absence of Jackson and the implications on the Army. What does he leave the Army as a positive legacy? That's something that stays with the Army after he's gone.
Yeah, that's superb, and it's important for us to think about this. Lee published an order after Jackson's death, trying to assuage the grief that a lot of the army was feeling. And I found traces of that grief historically, not only in letters from the erstwhile Stonewall Brigade and in Jackson's own corps, and it was throughout all the divisions of his corps, the soldiers were mourning his death, but also in McLaws and Anderson's divisions. You would find this evidence also in one chapter. I go into great detail about how Jackson's death was considered and thought about contextually at the time throughout the entire Confederacy. And I think you have to answer your question, you got to look at it within the Army, Northern Virginia, and then look at it throughout the Confederacy writ large. So first of all, within the Army, Northern Virginia, he left a legacy, most obviously, of conversion to Christianity and the revival that began under Chaplain Lacey, his court chaplain, is going to pick up speed even after his death. And there will be an incredible revival in the Army, Northern Virginia after Gettysburg. Now, it starts after Antietam, and then when Lacey comes in, it really goes up in crescendo during the winter of 62, 63, but it continues through Gettysburg, continues afterwards, and in fact, there are more conversions after Jackson's death. So the first legacy is one of, I think, a conversion to the Christian faith, or a reawakening of the Christian faith within the Army, Northern Virginia, and a sense that we are a Christian army doing God's will. This, of course, suited Robert E. Lee perfectly, and Lee was happy about this. He saw that as one of Jackson's great legacies, and at the time, he definitely said that. Um, I think, secondly, the spirit of Jackson as a fighter and as a leader was a bit of inspiration for his former divisions and the troops in them, but I think that that was less long-lived than some people would have us believe. Plus, it's hard to hammer that down with primary source evidence. There is some belief that the soldiers fought harder on May 3rd, 1863, and the third day at Chancellorsville because they were fighting for Jackson. The word spread that he had been wounded and that they needed to bring this thing home for him. So there's some evidence right there immediately after his wounding on the third day at Chancellorsville. Beyond that, that's harder to hammer home, but I do think that that spirit of the fighting spirit of Jackson's also infused through the Army, Northern Virginia, for a period of time. How long it perseveres, I can't say, Chris. Now, throughout the Confederacy, the eulogies and the editorials after his death were very, very telling. And they ran the gamut from absolute hair-wrenching and hair-tearing out grief to ominous warnings of putting too much stock in a pillar of flesh, i.e., a man instead of God, and that Jackson was struck down and taken away because the Confederacy was not adhering to God's will enough. And we got to remember, this is an era where the belief that God's will determined all was very, very prominent in both the North and the South. And there was a sense of dread throughout the people of the South. What does this mean that Jackson has been taken from us? Is this a portent of evil things to come? And there was as much of that that you would find in the editorials and the eulogies and admonitions that we need to reawaken and re-aliven or recreate our steadfast faith in God rather than in men. There was as much of that as there was just overall sadness at the loss of Jackson, and the loss that he represented to Lee was also very well understood by many in the Confederacy. So you have two different effects here. One in the Army, Northern Virginia itself, and then with the general people of the Confederacy also.
Yeah, yeah. So now we've been talking about your book, The Great Partnership, published in 2019. You've been up to some really cool stuff since then, though. So tell us a little bit about what you've got going on right now and some of the great stuff you're up to.
Oh, thanks for asking, Chris. So in 2021, I published Southern Strategies, Why the Confederacy Failed. That came out University Press of Kansas, and that is a more academic study that is written to explain some of the lesser understood reasons why the Confederacy toppled and fell to destruction. And it's interpreted through the lens of strategic theory, classical strategic theory, which we teach at the Army War College and many of our senior service colleges teach. And I've been teaching the Civil War that way for some time. So for me, it was a natural thing to actually put this into writing. I was editor of that volume. I wrote the first chapter in the introduction, and then it was contributed to by former colleagues and students, and they did a great job. And I would commend that book to anyone who's looking for the strategic reasons behind Confederate defeat, not just looking at battles, but how did diplomacy play into this, and how did the informational instrument of power play into this, and how did they interact with the economic and the military aspects of Confederate failure? So we kind of look at it in a holistic way strategically. So that was the 21 work. And
A
since then,
great,
I've
great
done.
book, by the way. Great book.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you. Thank you for reading it.
no, it's one of those things though. It's like, because people do tend to focus on those battle things, but like there's so much. Like it's baking in an oven with so many ingredients.
Right, right. Well, in the Trans-Mississippi, which is neglected even in a military sense, people have this myopia on the Eastern and maybe to a lesser degree the Western theaters. And perhaps that is true historically, that that's where the war was won and lost in those two theaters. But you can't forget the critical Trans-Mississippi. I have a contributor wrote on that, who's written a lot on the Trans-Mississippi previously. It's a great chapter that helps integrate the Trans-Mississippi into the overall picture of the Confederate war effort and how critical it really was. Um, so since then, I've written a couple scholarly articles and a couple offshoots off of both of those books for Gettysburg Magazine and a couple anthologies authored by other people. And my current project, which is about 60% written, is called Takeaways: The Practical Uses of Civil War History. That's its working title. We'll see if the press wants to change it. But I'm hoping to get that totally written by the end of the summer, get it off to my agent, and then we'll see where it lands. I write my books first and then go in search of a publisher through my agent's auspices. And that book is really marrying this idea of applied history, which is becoming more popular again. It once was very popular early in the middle part of the 20th century. And for listeners who don't know, applied history is essentially looking at history in a very pragmatic way. How does this help us think better about today and the future? It's about the thinking. So you focus on the decision making of leaders of the past, and not to the neglect of the common soldier, because there can be things learned from the common soldier's experience and some other more mundane things. But it's all about the so what for today, and that book focuses on that. And again, it in many ways mirrors how we teach history at the Army War College, how I've been teaching there for the last 20 years. And hopefully, readers will find that interesting as well. And at the
And
end of every section, I have a takeaway section. Okay, why do we care? What did we learn from this? And how is this immediately applicable? So,
I mean, we'll definitely have to get you back on to talk about that. To me, that is, I think one of the most vital topics we could possibly be discussing right now. Just like because we always sort of hear that old stereotype that we must learn from the past, we must study the past so we can learn its lessons. But then often if you apply those lessons or cherry pick those lessons, people get lessons they don't want to have to hear, and which
right.
which sort of gets to how inherently political history can be. So this idea of finding a usable history, to me, it's an urgent thing, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, and you don't have to have it become political or partisan. There's some basic things. For example, about the Chancellorsville campaign, I'm finishing that chapter literally right now. I was working on it this morning, in fact, on day 3 of Chancellorsville. And there's absolutely nothing political about it. It's about decision making and how not to make dumb mistakes. For instance, when you have a very strong position, albeit a salient at Hazel Grove, but you have most of a corps sitting there with a lot of artillery. Would it not be a good idea to give it a chance to see if it can fight off the attacks rather than peremptorily take everything off of it? Now, you can defend Hooker in that decision, but we all know that when he abandoned Hazel Grove, that sets up a mighty fall. I mean, it gives the Confederates a really good chance to actually unify the two wings of their army there and to possibly tactically win in the Chancellorsville area, at least in the campaign. And that's a lesson that anybody can absorb, Chris. I don't think you have to be a Politico or some sort of talking head to just kind of understand, wow, that was a mistake.
Yeah.
And then further, how do the Confederates monopolize upon that? So there are two sides of the coin. You can be given a gift by your adversary, whether it's in business or in war or in, I don't know, in education perhaps, or some sort of bureaucratic setting. But then how do you monopolize upon it and use it to good advantage? Well, certainly the Confederate artillery did, and Stuart recognized it for what it was, and ordered Alexander to get up there with his batteries, and that really started to change things.
Yeah.
But then other fluke events, like Revere's moving his brigade out, which opened up a gap in the Union line. One wonders if that hadn't happened, would maybe they still wouldn't have been able, the Confederates, to pull it through.
Yeah.
Thinking about how do you manage chance events, and I think one of the most striking ones I'm about to get into here is Hooker's knocked unconscious. So what happens when the head of your organization is suddenly removed? Do you have a succession plan worked out? Is someone guaranteed to come in? And are they given due authority to make decisions in the absence of the boss? How do you have that worked out in your organization? These are the kinds of things that I ask, in the book after I go through the history. Then I have that section at the end where I ask these questions of readers to make them ponder the value of the
I
book.
can't wait to read it. I can't wait to read it.
We'll have some fun. I look forward to another discussion on that, Chris.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I wish you the best of luck this summer getting that finished. And it's just been a real pleasure chatting with you today and catching up.
Thank you. Likewise, Chris, really enjoyed it. And just a plug for anyone who hasn't watched Chris's and his team's 160th series on YouTube, it's worth every second of your time.
Oh, thanks.
I have enjoyed those, and I watched a lot of them to just get my memory back on Chancellorsville since I haven't been doing staff rides down there as routinely as I once did. And they're just really well done, Chris. Kudos to you and your team.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Chris.
You bet.
Pleasure having you with us today. For
Thank you.
Chris Keller, I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.
Bye bye.